If everything they told you about the enemy was a lie, what else did they lie about? That question slammed into Reiko Nakamura's mind as she stared down at the metal tray in her hands. She was 22 years old, a nurse from Hiroshima. For 3 years, she had watched hundreds of people die from starvation and disease in field hospitals across the Pacific. And now, aboard an American warship, the enemy was handing her more food than she had seen in a week. White bread, soft and fresh, canned peaches swimming in thick syrup, beef stew with actual visible chunks of meat floating in rich brown gravy, butter in individual portions, coffee that smelled like something from another world. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from something far more dangerous. Doubt. August 20th, 1945. Apra Harbor, Guam. Nearly 300 Japanese women walked slowly up the gangway of an American transport ship. Their khaki uniforms were faded and torn. Their faces were hollow from exhaustion and hunger. They were nurses, radio operators, students, and clerks. Women who had been pulled into the war machine, promised glory for the empire, but given only ash and suffering in return. They moved in silence, surrounded by American guards. These soldiers, these men whose very existence contradicted everything the women had been taught to believe. For years, imperial propaganda had painted a very specific picture. Americans were weak. Their nation was collapsing under the weight of racial mixing and capitalist decay. Their men were soft from luxury. Their cities were falling into chaos. Their factories had gone silent. Bread lines stretched for miles through crumbling streets. But the soldiers standing before these women looked nothing like the propaganda posters. They were tall, broad-shouldered. They moved with a natural strength that seemed almost theatrical in its casual power. Their uniforms were clean and well-fitted. Their boots were new leather. Their skin was clear and healthy. One of the guards caught Reiko staring. He smiled and nodded politely before turning away. That simple gesture, that small act of casual humanity, unsettled her more than any threat could have. Among the 300, there were three whose stories would come to define this journey. Reiko Nakamura was 22, a nurse from Hiroshima who had spent 3 years in field hospitals watching young soldiers die in her arms. She had held them as they whispered their final words. She had told them their sacrifice mattered. She had promised them that America was starving too, that victory was coming, that their deaths would not be in vain. She believed every word she told them. Michiko Sato was 24, a mathematics student turned radio operator. For 18 months, she had broadcast fake victory reports across the airwaves. She read scripts about American ships sinking, about enemy forces retreating in chaos, about triumph after triumph that existed only on paper. She knew the reports were lies. Every radio operator knew, but she believed in the larger truth. America was struggling. America was weak. A few exaggerated numbers would not change the fundamental reality of their coming defeat. Ayumi Ishikawa was 18, just a girl really, a university student who had been pulled from her classroom at 17 and forced into a women's auxiliary unit. Her family had starved for 2 years under rationing that grew more severe with each passing month. The night before Ayumi left for her assignment, her father placed his rice bowl in front of her. "Eat," he said. "I'm already full." She was 17 and hungry and frightened. She believed him. She ate every grain. The next morning, her father did not wake up. He had given his last meal to his daughter. He died believing his sacrifice meant something, that his little girl would live, that Japan would win, that America would fall. Ayumi never forgave herself for eating that rice. These three women, bound together by geography and circumstance, were about to begin a journey that would shatter everything they had ever believed. To understand the shock that awaited them, you must first understand the world they came from. From the 1930s onward, the Japanese people had been fed a carefully constructed narrative through every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lecture. America was portrayed as a mongrel nation weakened by racial diversity and corrupted by capitalist greed. The propaganda was relentless and specific. American men were lazy, made soft by luxury and excess. American women were vulgar and shameless. American cities were crumbling under the weight of their own decadence. American factories had fallen silent. American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly equipped, fighting only for money rather than honor. These were not random lies. They were psychological weapons carefully designed to make sacrifice acceptable. If your enemy is dying, your own hunger has meaning. If their soldiers are weak, your brother's death has value. If their nation is collapsing, your suffering serves a purpose. The Ministry of Information controlled every image, every statistic, every whisper that reached the public. By 1945, most Japanese civilians genuinely believed that America was on the verge of collapse. Reiko carried this belief in every cell of her body. She had spent 3 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. She had watched boys her own age die from infections that proper medicine could have cured. She had held them as they gasped their final breaths, their eyes filled with faith in the cause. There was one boy she could never forget. His name was Kenji, 16 years old, a soldier who should have been in school studying for exams, dreaming about girls and baseball. Instead, he lay dying from an infected wound, his body burning with fever that no amount of herbs or prayers could break. In his final hours, he looked up at Reiko with eyes that still held innocence despite everything he had seen. "Sister," he whispered, using the honorific for nurse. "The Americans are starving too, yes, that is what they say." Reiko nodded, tears running down her face. "Yes, they are starving worse than us." The boy smiled, a peaceful smile. "Then my death is not wasted." He closed his eyes and never opened them again. Reiko had believed every word she told him. She had to believe it. The alternative was too terrible to consider. Michiko carried a different burden. As a radio operator, she had been on the inside of the propaganda machine. She had read the fake reports. She had seen the real casualty numbers before they were altered for broadcast. She knew that the great victory at Leyte Gulf had actually been a devastating defeat. But she told herself it did not matter. The core truth remained. America was stretched thin. America was suffering. A few adjusted numbers would not change the inevitable outcome. She remembered one night alone in the radio room after her shift, staring at the script she had just read. 47 American ships destroyed, the report claimed. The real number was 3. She had asked herself a question that night in the darkness, with only the static of the radio for company. If we are winning, why do we need to lie? She pushed the thought away, buried it deep, told herself that doubt was disloyalty. Ayumi carried the simplest and heaviest burden of all. She carried her father's death. She carried the memory of eating his last meal while he watched, smiling, telling her he was full when his stomach was empty. She carried the knowledge that he died believing his sacrifice would matter, that Japan would triumph, that his daughter would live to see victory. 3 women, 3 different stories, 3 variations of the same terrible faith. And now all 3 stood on the deck of an American ship watching the ruined coastline of Guam fade into the distance, heading toward an enemy nation they had been taught to despise and fear. The ship departed at dawn. In the first few hours, the women sat in silence in the converted cargo hold that would serve as their quarters. Canvas cots lined the walls. Wool blankets were stacked neatly at each bed. Wool blankets. Real wool. When was the last time any of them had touched real wool? They expected hardship. They expected punishment. They expected the brutality that their government had promised would come from American captors. What they received was lunch. The sound of boots on metal announced the arrival of American sailors carrying stack after stack of metal trays loaded with food. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on those trays with a mixture of hunger and terror. The food was placed on long tables in the center of the hold. Steam rose from serving containers. The smell was overwhelming, rich and warm and impossibly real. White bread, not the gritty mixture of sawdust and rice hulls they had eaten for years. Actual white bread made from pure flour. Canned peaches and syrup so thick and sweet it seemed obscene. Beef stew with chunks of meat visible in every serving. Real beef, real meat, not the stringy mystery protein stretched with vegetables and prayers. Butter, individual portions of golden butter for each woman. Coffee, hot and strong and aromatic. And the portions were enormous, more food on a single tray than most of these women had seen in a week. At first, no one moved. Tomoko Fujimoto, a 35-year-old former school teacher who had emerged as the unofficial leader of the group, spoke sharply. "Do not touch it. This is a trap. They want to see us debase ourselves." The women stared at the food. 300 stomachs growled in unison. 300 minds fought against 300 bodies. Then one woman, a radio operator named Fumiko, reached for a piece of bread. She tore it slowly, examined the texture, smelled it. White bread, pure flour, no sawdust, no tree bark, no rice hulls mixed in to stretch the supply. She took a bite. Her eyes went wide. She took another bite, then another. Faster now, stuffing the bread into her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she chewed. That broke the dam. 300 women descended on the food like wolves, because that is what they were, starving, malnourished to the point where their bodies had begun consuming themselves. They ate with desperate speed, barely chewing, shoveling food into mouths that had forgotten the sensation of fullness. And as they ate, as sugar entered their bloodstreams and protein began the slow work of rebuilding wasted muscle, a terrible question formed in 300 minds simultaneously. If they have enough food to give prisoners this much, how much do they have for themselves? The meals continued, 3 times a day, every day for 10 days. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs with toast and jam and orange juice. Lunch alternated between thick sandwiches piled with meat and cheese or soups so rich they seemed almost vulgar in their abundance. Dinner always included protein vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dessert. There was always dessert. Cookies, cake, pudding, fruit cocktails swimming in syrup so sweet it made their teeth ache. On the third day, Reiko witnessed something that broke something fundamental inside her understanding of the world. She had wandered near the galley, drawn by the smell of cooking food. An American sailor sat at a small table eating his lunch. He was young, maybe 20, with freckled skin and red hair. He ate quickly, carelessly, the way someone eats when food has never been precious. When he finished, he scraped the remaining food from his plate into a garbage bin. Half his lunch, thrown away. Reiko stood frozen, watching that food fall into the trash. The sound it made hitting the metal seemed to echo through her entire body. That discarded meal would have fed her family for 2 days. She remembered her mother's hands trembling constantly from malnutrition, unable to hold a teacup steady. She remembered her little brother Kenji, 8 years old, his growth permanently stunted because his body never had enough fuel to develop properly. She remembered her father, a factory worker, who gave his children his rice portions until he became too weak to work. And here the enemy threw food away as if it meant nothing. Michiko had her own revelation on day 5. She was standing near the ship's galley when she saw the cook dump an entire pot of rice overboard. A whole pot. Enough rice to feed a platoon. The cook noticed her staring. Through the interpreter, a Japanese-American woman in a U.S. Army uniform, he explained. Overcooked. Nobody wants mushy rice. We make fresh. Michiko found her voice, though it shook. What about rationing? Do you not save food? The interpreter looked genuinely confused. Rationing, honey. America stopped rationing food back in '43. Even that was voluntary. Sugar and butter mostly. Nothing serious. The words did not make sense. They could not make sense. No rationing. Food so abundant, they threw it away. Michiko had spent 18 months broadcasting stories about American starvation, about bread lines and food riots, and a nation on the edge of collapse. All lies. Every word. She found a corner of the ship where no one could see her and vomited until nothing remained. That night in the converted cargo hold, whispered conversations began to spread through the darkness. Did you see the guards' boots, new leather? Perfect condition. The blankets they gave us are wool, real wool. We have not had wool in years. The medical officer has actual medicine, morphine, sulfa drugs, not the watered-down military-grade garbage that barely worked. One by one, observations accumulated. Small details that meant nothing in isolation, but together painted a picture that contradicted everything they had been taught. Ayumi, the youngest among them, finally said what everyone was thinking. It was all lies. Tomoko, the former teacher, the leader, the believer, snapped back immediately. Be quiet. You will bring punishment on all of us. But her voice shook when she said it. The response was not agreement. Not yet. The change was too sudden, too complete, too terrifying to accept all at once. But the seed had been planted, and with every meal, every glimpse of American abundance, every casual display of wealth, that their captors did not even notice that seed grew. On the 7th day, the coastline of California emerged through the morning fog. The women were permitted on deck in shifts for exercise. Reiko stood at the railing, her fingers gripping the cold metal, watching the shore materialize through the mist. And then San Francisco appeared, and the world ended. Skyscrapers, dozens of them, towers of steel and glass stabbing up through the clouds like monuments to a god of industry. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the bay, impossibly massive, painted bright orange, carrying hundreds of vehicles across its span. Not military vehicles, civilian cars and trucks moving freely casually as if this miracle of engineering was simply part of daily life. The harbor swarmed with activity, cranes unloading cargo ships, warehouses the size of city blocks, goods moving in organized chaos, ships of every size coming and going. And beyond the harbor, the city itself. Buildings stacked up the hills, streets laid out in perfect grids, lights flickering on as evening approached. This was supposed to be a dying nation. This was supposed to be defeat. Ayumi stood beside Reiko at the railing, her knuckles white from gripping the metal. "It is not real," she whispered. "It must be a movie set, a trick." But movie sets do not smell like diesel and salt air. Movie sets do not hum with electrical power. Movie sets do not stretch to the horizon in every direction, solid and real and utterly devastating. An American sailor walked past, whistling, hands in his pockets. Just another Tuesday in San Francisco. He glanced at the Japanese women, nodded politely, and continued on his way. For him, this was normal. The city, the abundance, the power. All of it was simply the ordinary background of his ordinary life. Reiko turned away from the railing. She could not look anymore. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Every truth she had built her life upon was crumbling like paper in fire. If America looked like this now, after 4 years of total war, what had it looked like before? And even more terrifying, if this was just a coastal city, what did their industrial heartland look like? The train ride east would answer that question with brutal clarity. The question that would not die. That night, as the ship prepared to dock and transfer its passengers to a train bound for Wisconsin, 300 women lay awake in their bunks. The whispered conversations had stopped. There was nothing left to say that had not already been thought by everyone. Reiko stared at the metal ceiling above her cot and remembered every soldier who had died in her arms. Every young man who had whispered his final prayer, believing that his sacrifice mattered. Every mother's son who had gone to his death, trusting that the enemy was weak, that victory was near, that his pain had purpose. She had told them America was starving. She had looked into their dying eyes and lied. Not intentionally, she had believed it too, but the result was the same. Michiko lay in her bunk calculating numbers she wished she did not know. Production capacity, resource availability, industrial output, the mathematics of inevitable defeat that no amount of propaganda could change. She had spent 18 months making people believe in victory. Every fake broadcast, every inflated number, every story of American weakness, all of it had kept the war going. All of it had sent more young men to die for a cause that was already lost. How many deaths were on her hands? How many mothers received folded flags because she made them believe? Ayumi lay silent, thinking of her father, of that last bowl of rice, of the way he smiled as he watched her eat, knowing he would never eat again. He died believing. He died with faith. And now his daughter knew that faith was built on nothing but lies. The ship's engines hummed through the hull. The California coast glittered in the distance. And 300 women faced the most terrifying question any human being can ask. If everything you believed was wrong, what do you believe now? End of part 1. The journey had only begun. The train ride across America would show them things even more devastating than San Francisco. And the truth waiting at the end of the line would break them in ways they could not yet imagine. Not because America was cruel, but because America was kind. And that kindness would prove more difficult to accept than any punishment could have been. The transfer happened at dawn. 300 women walked down the gangway onto American soil for the first time. Their legs were unsteady after 10 days at sea. The concrete of the San Francisco pier felt strange and solid beneath their worn shoes. Military trucks waited in a neat line. But these were not the cramped transport vehicles they expected. These were passenger buses with cushioned seats and large windows. Clean, well-maintained, almost comfortable. The ride to the train station took 20 minutes through streets that seemed designed to maximize the psychological impact of everything they saw. Shops with full window displays, restaurants with customers eating meals that would have fed a Japanese family for a week, Cars everywhere, civilian vehicles in bright colors driven by ordinary people going about ordinary lives. A woman in a red dress walked a small dog on a leash. She carried a paper bag from a bakery. The casual luxury of that image, a woman buying pastries for pleasure, burned itself into Reiko's memory. At the station, they boarded a passenger train. Not a freight car, not a cattle transport, an actual passenger train with upholstered seats and dining cars and windows that opened to let in fresh air. The seats were soft. The windows were clean. Small tables folded down from the backs of the seats in front. Tomoko, the former teacher, the stubborn believer, sat rigid in her seat and refused to touch anything. Her jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. She was holding on to something, some last fragment of the world she understood, but that fragment was cracking with every passing mile. The train pulled out of San Francisco Station at 9 in the morning. For the next 3 days, America would scroll past their windows like a film designed to destroy everything they had ever believed. The farmland. The cities gave way to farmland within hours, and the farmland never stopped. Fields stretched to the horizon in every direction. Not the small terraced plots of Japanese agriculture carved painstakingly into hillsides and tended by hand. These were vast expanses of cultivated earth that seemed to curve with the planet itself. Wheat fields glowed golden in the autumn sun. The stalks rippled in the wind like waves on an ocean made of grain. Mile after mile after mile of food simply growing, waiting to be harvested. Orchards appeared rows of trees so perfectly aligned, they created geometric patterns when viewed from the moving train. Apples, pears, peaches, fruit hanging heavy on branches that bent under the weight of abundance. Vegetable farms spread across valley floors, corn standing tall in endless rows. Tomatoes ripening in fields that covered more ground than entire Japanese villages. And the machines. Massive harvesting equipment moved through the fields like metal giants. One machine could do the work of 100 laborers. One machine could harvest in a day what would take a Japanese farming family a week of backbreaking effort. Michiko pressed her face against the window and watched a combine harvester move through a wheat field. The machine was enormous, painted bright red, cutting a swath through the golden grain that would have taken her father's entire village working together from dawn to dusk. She had grown up in a farming community outside Osaka. She knew agriculture. She knew the brutal labor of rice cultivation, the constant battle against weather and insects in exhausted soil. She knew how a bad season could destroy a family, how a drought could kill a village. What she saw through that window was not farming, as she understood it. It was industry, mechanized, efficient, producing surplus beyond anything she could have imagined. The interpreter, a Japanese-American woman named Grace, who had been assigned to help with communication, noticed Michiko staring. "Beautiful country, is it not?" Grace said in Japanese. Her accent was slightly off, American vowels, creeping into the familiar syllables. Michiko did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "How much land is there?" Grace smiled. "We are crossing California now, then Nevada, then Utah, then Wyoming, then Nebraska, then Iowa, then Wisconsin. 3 days of travel and farmland most of the way. 3 days of farmland." Michiko closed her eyes. The numbers were forming in her head again. Bridge, yield per acre, caloric output, the mathematics of abundance that made Japanese agriculture look like children playing in gardens. The children, on the second day, the train stopped at a small station in Nebraska, a town of perhaps 2,000 people surrounded by fields of corn and wheat. A water tower stood against the sky with the town's name painted on its side in faded letters. The women were permitted to stretch their legs on the platform while the train took on water and supplies. Armed guards stood at relaxed attention, more ceremonial than threatening. And there were children, American children playing on the station platform, chasing each other, laughing, apparently unaware or unconcerned about the foreign women emerging from the train. Reiko watched them through eyes that could not quite believe what they were seeing. The children were tall, healthy, their clothes were clean and well-fitted, their faces were round with proper nutrition. Their movements were quick and energetic, powered by bodies that had never known true hunger. A boy of perhaps 10 years old ran past, nearly colliding with Reiko before swerving at the last moment. He looked up at her, grinned, said something in English she did not understand, and continued his pursuit of another child. His teeth were straight and white, his hair was thick and shiny, his skin was clear and flushed with health. Reiko thought of her brother, little Kenji, 8 years old and barely 4 feet tall, growth permanently stunted because his body had never received enough nutrition to develop properly. His teeth were already rotting from malnutrition. His hair was thin and brittle. His skin had a grayish pallor that never quite went away no matter how much he slept. These American children, some younger than her brother, stood taller than him. They moved with strength he would never possess. They radiated health that he would never know. The comparison was not humbling. It was annihilating. Ayumi stood beside Reiko, watching the same children with the same devastated expression. "They do not know," Ayumi whispered. "They do not know how fortunate they are." Reiko shook her head slowly. "They cannot know. This is normal for them. They have nothing to compare it to." The train whistle blew. Time to reboard. But before they returned to their seats, something happened that would haunt Reiko for the rest of her life. The apple. A girl stood near the edge of the platform, 10 years old perhaps, 11. Brown hair in 2 braids, a dress with small flowers printed on the fabric, clean white socks and polished shoes. She was eating an apple. The apple was large and red and perfect. The kind of apple that would have cost a week's wages in wartime Japan if it could be found at all. The girl bit into it. Once, twice, 3 times. Then she decided she did not want it anymore. Her small hand swung back and tossed the apple into a trash bin at the edge of the platform. 3 bites, then garbage. Reiko watched that apple arc through the air and disappear into the bin. The sound it made hitting the metal bottom seemed to echo through her entire body. She could not move, could not breathe, could not process what she had just witnessed. That apple, casually discarded by a child who simply changed her mind, would have been treasured in her household. Her family had once shared a single bruised apple among 5 people, passing it around the table, each person taking tiny bites to make it last, savoring the sweetness like it was sacred. Her father had given up his share so the children could have more. Her mother had pretended she was not hungry. Her brother Kenji had cried when there was no more. And here an American child threw away a perfect apple because she did not feel like finishing it. This was not excess. This was something beyond excess. This was waste so normalized, so casual, so deeply embedded in daily life that a child thought nothing of discarding food that would have been precious beyond words in Japan. Reiko finally understood something that had been forming in her mind since the first meal on the ship. The war was never about military strength. It was never about strategy or bravery or the spirit of the warrior. It was about this, about capacity, about resources, about the ability to produce so much that waste became meaningless. Japan had been fighting a nation that could throw away food without thought, a nation whose children did not know hunger, a nation so wealthy that abundance was simply the invisible air they breathed. They never had a chance, not from the first day, not ever, Gary, Indiana. On the 3rd day, the train passed through Gary, Indiana. The women had grown quieter as the journey progressed. The initial shock had given way to a kind of numb acceptance. Their eyes still watched the landscape passing outside, but the reactions had become muted. There was only so much devastation a mind could process before it began to protect itself. But Gary broke through that numbness. The steel mills appeared on the horizon like a range of industrial mountains. Smokestacks rose hundreds of feet into the air, breathing fire and smoke into the gray sky. Furnaces glowed orange through massive buildings that covered more ground than entire Japanese neighborhoods. The scale was incomprehensible. One facility, then another, stretching along the rail line for miles, an entire landscape dedicated to the production of steel. Grace the interpreter noticed the women pressing against the windows. "The steel mills," she said. "They run 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. They have operated like this throughout the entire war, producing steel for ships and tanks and aircraft." She paused, then added a detail that landed like a physical blow. "These mills produced more steel in 1943 alone than Japan has manufactured in its entire history." No one responded. There was no response possible. Michiko stared at the furnaces glowing against the evening sky and felt her mind doing the calculations it could not stop doing. Steel output, ship construction, aircraft production, tank manufacturing, ammunition. weapons, supplies. The numbers she was computing in her head were not just unfavorable. They were absurd. They described a contest between a child and a giant. They explained everything she had witnessed and everything she had refused to understand. She had spent 18 months broadcasting stories of American weakness, American struggle, American defeat. And here was the truth burning orange against the Indiana sky. Here was the reality that no amount of propaganda could ever hide. America had not been struggling. America had been producing, endlessly, effortlessly, machines building, weapons building victory. The war had been decided before it ever began. The breaking point. That night in the dining car, Machiko could no longer contain what was building inside her. The car was quiet. The women ate their evening meal in near silence. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, chocolate pudding for dessert, another impossible meal, another casual display of abundance. Machiko set down her fork. Her hands were trembling. She stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that drew every eye in the car. "I need to say something." Her voice was louder than she intended. 300 faces turned toward her. The American guards near the doors shifted slightly but did not intervene. "I've been calculating. For 3 days I've been calculating." Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "America produces 54 times more oil than we do." She let that number hang in the air. "Every American soldier receives 4,000 calories per day. Our soldiers receive 1,500. Another pause. "They built 2,600 warships. We built 540. Her voice was rising now, cracking at the edges. "They manufactured 96,000 aircraft. We manufactured 28,000. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "For every barrel of oil we refined, they produced 54. The numbers poured out of her like blood from a wound. "We never had a chance." Her voice broke into something between a scream and a sob. "They knew. Our leaders knew. They had these numbers. They had to have known." Tears streamed down her face. After 1942, after Midway, after the tide turned, they knew, and they kept sending us to die. They kept telling us to sacrifice. They kept promising victory that was already impossible. She was shouting now, her composure completely shattered. Every death after 1942 was murder. Our own government murdered our own people for 3 more years of pride. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the American guards stood frozen, not understanding the Japanese words but recognizing the raw anguish in her voice. Michiko stood swaying for a moment. Then her legs gave out and she collapsed back into her seat, her body shaking with sobs that she could no longer control. The confrontation. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Tomoko stood up. The former teacher, the unofficial leader, the woman who had insisted on discipline and faith and proper behavior throughout the journey. Her face was red. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "Enough," she said. Her voice was hard and cold. "You are demoralizing everyone. You are spreading enemy propaganda. You are betraying your country." Michiko looked up at her through tear-blurred eyes. "I am telling the truth." "The truth," Tomoko's voice rose. "The truth is that we lost. The truth is that we are prisoners. But we lost with honor. We fought with honor. Our sacrifices had meaning." What meaning? The question came from Reiko. She had risen from her seat without consciously deciding to. She stood between Tomoko and Michiko, her face pale, but her voice steady. "What meaning did their deaths have?" "Boya." Tomoko turned toward her. "They died for Japan. They died for the emperor. They died so that we might live. They died for lies." Reiko's voice was quiet but carried through the silent car. "I held them when they died. Young boys, soldiers who should have been in school. I held them in my arms and told them America was starving. I told them their sacrifice mattered. I told them victory was coming." Her voice cracked. "They believed me. They died believing me." She took a step toward Tomoko. "But I was wrong. I was passing on lies that I believed. And now I know the truth. America was never starving. America was throwing food away. America was producing more than we could ever dream of matching." Tears were falling now, but she did not wipe them away. "Those boys died for nothing. for pride, for stubbornness, for leaders who knew the war was lost and kept fighting anyway. Tomoko raised her hand and slapped Reiko across the face. The sound echoed through the car. Reiko did not flinch. She did not raise her hand in return. She simply stood there, her cheek reddening, tears mixing with the mark of Tomoko's palm. "Violence does not change truth," she said softly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, women began to stand. One by one, 10 by 10, until nearly 200 of the 300 women in that car were on their feet. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their standing was statement enough. They stood with Reiko. They stood with Machiko. They stood with the truth no matter how painful it was. Tomoko looked around at the silent faces, at the women she had led and lectured and tried to hold together through discipline and faith. She saw the verdict in their eyes. She backed against the wall of the car, her shoulders beginning to shake. The certainty that had sustained her was crumbling. The beliefs that had given structure to her world were dissolving. And in their place was nothing but the terrible empty space where meaning used to be. The collapse, late that night when most of the women had retreated to their sleeping berths, Tomoko sat alone at the end of the dining car. The lights had been dimmed. Outside the windows, America rolled by in darkness, occasional lights flickering past like stars moving sideways. Ayumi found her there, the youngest of the three women whose stories had come to represent the journey, 18 years old, a girl who had eaten her father's last meal and watched him die. She sat down beside Tomoko without speaking. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The train rocked gently. The wheels clicked against the tracks in a steady rhythm. Finally, Tomoko spoke. Her voice was barely audible. "I was a teacher." Ayumi waited. "I taught children to love the empire. I told them stories of Japanese greatness. I showed them maps of our expanding territory. I made them believe in victory." Her voice broke. "I made them believe." Tears began to fall, though her face remained rigid. "And they went to war believing. My students, my children, they went to die believing everything I told them." Her composure finally shattered. "They trusted me. They trusted me to tell them the truth, and I lied to them. I did not know I was lying, but I lied." Her body began to shake with sobs. "How many of my students are dead now? How many died believing what I taught them?" Ayumi reached out and took her hand. "You did not know," she said gently. "None of us knew. They lied to all of us. But I should have questioned. I should have thought. I was a teacher. I was supposed to know things." Ayumi squeezed her hand. "My father died believing too. He gave me his last rice believing that his sacrifice mattered, believing that Japan would win, believing that I would see victory." She paused. "He was wrong. But I cannot be angry at him for being wrong. I can only be angry at the ones who lied to him." Tomoko looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. "The anger should go to Tokyo, to the ministers, to the generals, to everyone who knew the truth and hid it, not to us. We were victims too." Reiko and Machiko appeared from the shadows. They had been listening. Now they came and sat with the other two women. Four women, four different paths to the same devastating truth. Four broken believers trying to find a way forward. They sat together in silence as the train carried them through the night. Outside, America stretched endless in the darkness. Inside, something that had been shattered was slowly, painfully beginning to heal. Not through forgetting, not through denial, but through shared grief and shared rage and the first tentative steps toward acceptance. It was Machiko who finally spoke the thought that had been growing in all their minds. "The question is not why we lost." The others looked at her. "The question is why they let it continue. Why, when they had such overwhelming strength, did they not end it sooner?" Ayumi's voice was barely a whisper. "Hiroshima, Nagasaki." The names hung in the air like ghosts. "Did they have other choices?" Ayumi continued. "Could they have ended it differently?" No one answered. There was no easy answer. There was only tragedy layered upon tragedy, stretching back to decisions made in offices far from the dying and the death. Machiko shook her head slowly. "I do not know if they had other choices, but I know this. Our leaders had choices too. They chose to continue fighting when fighting was already hopeless. They chose to sacrifice hundreds of thousands more lives for pride." She stared out the window at the darkness. Hiroshima burns in my memory. Nagasaki burns in my memory. But so do all the deaths in between. All the soldiers and civilians who died in those final 3 years when victory was already impossible. Reiko nodded slowly. The bombs were terrible, but the 3 years before them were also terrible. And those years were a choice. Our choice. Our leader's choice. Tomoko spoke for the first time in several minutes. There is blame enough for everyone, for every side, for every leader, for everyone who chose war and kept choosing war when peace was possible. She wiped her eyes. But we cannot carry all the blame. We can only carry our own, and we can only decide what to do now, how to live with what we know. The train rolled on through the darkness. Wisconsin was only hours away now. Camp McCoy, their destination, their prison. But they were beginning to understand that the true prison had never been a place. The true prison had been the lies. And they had already escaped that prison, even if the escape had cost them everything they once believed. Dawn broke over Wisconsin as the train began its final approach. The landscape here was different from California or the Great Plains. Rolling hills covered with forests just beginning to turn color. Lakes appearing between the trees, their surfaces reflecting the early morning sky. Small farms tucked into valleys, smoke rising from chimneys in the cool autumn air. It was beautiful, peaceful, a world away from war. The women gathered their few belongings and prepared to disembark. 3 days of travel, 3 days of revelation, 3 days that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Camp McCoy appeared through the morning mist, and once again reality contradicted expectation. They had expected prison, barbed wire and guard towers, and the grim apparatus of captivity. What they found was rows of wooden buildings with smoke rising from chimneys, grass lawns between the barracks, trees planted along walkways, something that looked more like a camp than a prison. The guards who received them were professional but not threatening. One of them, a young man with a friendly face, actually smiled and waved. Grace, the interpreter, walked beside the women as they were led toward their quarters. "These buildings have heating," she said. "Hot showers. The mess hall serves 3 meals a day. There is a library, a recreation yard." Tomoko, walking nearby, spoke without looking at her. Why treat us this way? We are enemies." Grace considered the question for a moment. "The Geneva Convention requires certain standards for prisoners, but also," she hesitated, "America has already won. What purpose would cruelty serve?" She gestured toward the buildings. "There is enough food, enough space, enough resources. Why not use them? Why create suffering when suffering is not necessary?" It was such a simple concept, so obvious when stated plainly. And yet it represented a worldview so different from everything these women had been taught that it might as well have been a message from another planet. In the Japan they had known, suffering was noble, sacrifice was virtue, scarcity was the natural state of existence. Here abundance was so complete that kindness cost nothing. Generosity was not sacrifice, but simply the efficient use of excess. They walked toward their new quarters, toward hot showers and warm beds and meals that would continue to challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. Behind them, the train that had carried them across America began its journey back to the coast. Ahead of them lay weeks and months of adjustment, of processing, of slowly rebuilding an understanding of reality from the wreckage of their former beliefs. The truth had not killed them, but the kindness of their enemies would prove almost harder to bear than cruelty could ever have been. The journey across America had ended, but the real journey was only beginning. In the weeks to come, these women would face challenges they could not yet imagine. Not the challenges of survival or resistance. The challenge of accepting kindness from those they had been taught to hate. The challenge of receiving compassion from the enemy. The challenge of rebuilding a self when the foundations of that self had turned to sand. Camp McCoy waited, and with it the final and most difficult truths of all. The barracks were warm. That was the first thing Reiko noticed as she stepped through the door of Building 7, the structure that would house her and 49 other women for the duration of their captivity. The air inside was warm, not the damp cold she had expected from a prison, not the bitter chill of inadequate shelter that she had known for the past 3 years. Warmth, real, steady, reliable warmth from a heating system that simply worked. The building was divided into two large rooms with rows of metal beds along each wall. Each bed had a mattress, an actual mattress, not a wooden board or a canvas stretched over a frame. Clean sheets, wool blankets folded at the foot, a pillow. Reiko stood in the doorway and could not move. Behind her, other women filed in and stopped one by one, creating a silent congregation of disbelief. A guard, a young American private with red hair and freckles, noticed their hesitation. Through Grace, the interpreter, he spoke. Go ahead and pick your beds. Dinner is at 6. Showers are in the building next door, open all day. Hot water. He said it casually, routinely, as if hot water available all day was simply how the world worked. Tomoko was the first to move. She walked to a bed in the corner, sat down on the mattress, and immediately stood back up. Her hand pressed against the surface where she had sat, testing its reality. It is soft, she said to no one in particular. Her voice held a quality of wonder that bordered on fear. One by one, the women chose beds. They sat on mattresses. They touched wool blankets. They looked at pillows as if they were artifacts from a civilization they had only read about. Ayumi lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling. Tears began to leak from the corners of her eyes, running sideways into her hair. No one asked why she was crying. They all knew. They were all fighting the same battle inside themselves. This was kindness. This was comfort. This was everything they had been taught to expect from their own country and never received, now being offered freely by the enemy. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. The shower building broke them. Reiko entered the long concrete structure with a group of 20 women later that first afternoon. They had been given towels. Actual towels, thick and absorbent, not the thin rags they had used for years. They had been given soap, bars of white soap that smelled of flowers. The shower room had 2 rows of heads along opposite walls, metal pipes and valves, concrete floors with drains. A female American guard demonstrated how to operate the system. Turn the handle one way for cold, turn it the other way for hot. Simple. The guard left. The women stood in the empty room, looking at the shower heads as if they might attack. Fumiko, the radio operator, who had been the first to eat on the ship, was the first to try on. She turned the handle. Water burst from the head above her, splattering against the concrete. Hot water. Steam began to rise. She stepped under it, fully clothed, and screamed. Not a scream of pain, a scream of something else entirely. Release, grief, joy, rage, all of it mixed together in a sound that was barely human. She stood under that water uniform, soaking through, and screamed until her voice gave out. Then she slid down the wall and sat on the wet concrete, water streaming over her, sobbing. The other women watched. Some began to undress. Some began to cry before they even reached the water. Reiko stepped under a shower head and let the heat wash over her. She had not been truly clean in years. Soap had vanished from civilian life in Japan long before she left. Bathing had become a matter of cold water and ash and prayer. Now hot water poured over her skin, soap lathered in her hands, dirt and grime that had become part of her identity washed away and swirled down the drain. She stood under that water for 20 minutes, maybe longer. She lost track of time. When she finally stepped out, she felt like a different person. Not just cleaner, different, as if some layer of herself had been stripped away along with the dirt. Michiko sat on a bench near the entrance, wrapped in a towel, staring at nothing. When I was broadcasting, she said quietly, I read reports about American deprivation, water shortages, fuel rationing, collapsing infrastructure. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. They have hot water for prisoners, unlimited, hot water that they just let run down the drain. She shook her head slowly. Every word I spoke was a lie, every single word. The doctors came on the second day. American military physicians, both men and women, set up examination stations in a building near the barracks. The women were processed in groups of 20, moving through stations where they were measured, weighed, tested, and evaluated. The doctors were professional, clinical. They asked questions through interpreters, made notes on clipboards, and consulted with each other in low voices. But their faces told a story that their professional manner could not hide. They were shocked. Reiko watched as a female doctor examined Ayumi. The doctor measured her height, weighed her, checked her bone density, examined her teeth, tested her reflexes. With each measurement, the doctor's expression grew more troubled. Finally, she spoke to her colleague in English. Grace translated, her voice carefully neutral. Severe malnutrition, bone density significantly below normal for her age. Evidence of prolonged protein deficiency. Parasitic infection probable. Growth appears to have been stunted during developmental years. She paused. In the United States, this level of malnutrition in a young person would trigger an investigation for child abuse. Ayumi sat on the examination table, not understanding the English words, but reading the doctor's face clearly enough. "Is something wrong with me?" she asked through Grace. The doctor's expression softened. She spoke directly to Ayumi, waiting for the translation. "You have been through a very difficult time. Your body shows the effects of prolonged food shortage. But you are young. With proper nutrition, you can recover much of what was lost." She paused. "You are safe now. There is enough food here. You will not be hungry anymore." Ayumi nodded, but her eyes remained distant. The idea of not being hungry was so foreign that it did not quite register as real. The examinations continued throughout the day. The results painted a devastating picture. Average height of the women just over 5 feet, significantly below the height of American women the same age. Average weight 90 pounds, dangerously underweight by any medical standard. Bone density severely compromised in nearly every case. Nutritional deficiencies widespread and severe. Parasitic infections common. Dental problems almost universal. The American medical staff had seen prisoners before. They had treated soldiers from brutal combat conditions. But the systemic prolonged malnutrition evident in these women represented something different. This was not the result of a few bad months. This was years of deprivation, years of slow starvation, years of a body consuming itself to survive. One of the doctors, a man in his 50s with gray at his temples, spoke to his colleagues in a voice loud enough for Grace to overhear and later translate. "This is what happens when a government decides that feeding its people is less important than fighting a war it cannot win. These women were not starved by their enemies. They were starved by their own leaders." He shook his head. "Remember this when someone talks about the glory of war." The contrast was impossible to ignore. The American nurses who assisted with the examinations stood like members of a different species. They were tall, 5'6", 5'7", some even taller. Their shoulders were broad, their arms were strong, their skin was clear and flushed with health. They moved with energy and confidence. They smiled easily. They laughed at jokes that Reiko could not understand. They were approximately the same age as the Japanese women, but they looked like adults standing among children. Reiko, who had spent 3 years as a nurse herself, watched them with a mixture of admiration and despair. She knew medicine, or she thought she had known medicine, but the knowledge gap between what she had learned and what these women knew was vast. She watched an American nurse prepare an injection with casual efficiency. The needle was new, the medication was real, the technique was precise and practiced. Reiko remembered the field hospitals, the shortages, the desperate improvisations, the soldiers who died from infections that proper antibiotics could have cured, the surgeries performed with inadequate anesthesia, the screaming, always the screaming. Here there was no screaming, here there were supplies, here there was everything needed to actually help people. The American nurse noticed Reiko watching. She smiled and spoke through Grace. "You were a nurse too." Reiko nodded. "Where did you serve field hospitals?" "Guam, Saipan, other islands." The American woman's expression shifted to something like respect. "That must have been very difficult. I have heard the conditions were extreme." Reiko did not know how to respond. Difficult seemed like such an inadequate word. "We did not have medicine," she finally said. "We did not have supplies. We had nothing, only hands and prayers." The American nurse was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. "War is terrible. For everyone." It was such a simple statement, such an obvious truth, and yet hearing it from an American from the enemy, from someone who had no reason to offer sympathy, unlocked something in Reiko that she had been holding shut for years. She excused herself, found an empty corner, and wept. October dissolved into November. November faded into December. The women of Camp McCoy settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible just months before. 3 meals a day, every day, without fail. Breakfast brought eggs or pancakes or oatmeal, toast with butter and jam, orange juice, coffee or tea. Lunch offered sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, soups rich with vegetables and protein, salads with fresh greens. Dinner was always substantial, roasted chicken or beef or pork, potatoes and vegetables, bread and butter, and always dessert. The women gained weight. Their hair began to regain its luster. Their skin cleared. Their energy returned. Machiko threw herself into learning English. A guard named Smith, a quiet man in his 40s, became her informal tutor. He had lost a son in the Pacific and had every reason to hate these women. Instead, he spent his free hours teaching Machiko vocabulary and grammar. They did not speak of the war. They spoke of mathematics, which Machiko loved, and of Smith's farm in Wisconsin, which he would return to when his service ended. They spoke of books and weather and the small details of daily life. One evening, Machiko asked him why he was helping her. Smith was quiet for a long moment. "My boy is gone," he said finally. "Nothing changes that. Hating you won't bring him back. Teaching you feels like building something instead of destroying something." He shrugged. "Maybe that's all any of us can do now. Build instead of destroy." Ayumi discovered the library. It was a small room in one of the administrative buildings lined with shelves of books in English. But there were also materials in Japanese that had been gathered specifically for the prisoners. Ayumi read everything she could find about American education. High schools that were free and open to everyone. Universities that admitted women. Degree programs in engineering and medicine and law, all available to any student with the ability and determination to succeed. She had been pulled from Tokyo University at 17, her education sacrificed to the war effort. Now she learned that her American counterparts had continued their studies throughout the conflict. They had become engineers and doctors and scientists while she had been filing paperwork in a military office. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, but so did something else. Something that might have been hope. If the war was over, if Japan was being rebuilt, perhaps she could still become something. Perhaps her education was not lost forever. Perhaps the future held possibilities that the past had denied. Reiko worked alongside the American medical staff whenever they would allow it. She learned about antibiotics and their proper use. She learned about sterilization procedures that actually worked. She learned about diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols that seemed almost miraculous compared to what she had known. She also learned something else, something harder to define. She learned that the Americans did not hate her. Some were indifferent, some were curious, a few were even kind, but hatred was rare. These people had fought a brutal war. They had lost friends and brothers and sons, and yet they did not look at her with the burning contempt she had been taught to expect. The propaganda had promised that Americans were savages, brutal, merciless, driven by hatred of all things Japanese. The reality was so different that Reiko sometimes wondered if she had crossed into another dimension entirely. In December, a lieutenant colonel came to give a presentation about American war production. The women gathered in the largest building on the camp, a hall that served as a meeting space and occasionally as a chapel. Rows of chairs had been set up facing a small stage where charts and graphs hung from easels. The lieutenant colonel was a thin man with glasses and a patient voice. He did not seem interested in gloating or humiliation. He spoke like a teacher delivering a history lesson. Through grace, he began to present the numbers. Aircraft production, 2 charts side by side. Japan had manufactured approximately 28,000 military aircraft during the entire war. The United States had produced over 96,000. Ship construction, another pair of charts. Japan had built around 540 warships of various classes. The United States had built over 2,600. Deal production. The American output was so much larger that the Japanese figure barely registered on the same chart. Oil. This was the number that seemed to strike the deepest. For every barrel of oil that Japan refined, the lieutenant colonel said, the United States produced 54. He let that number hang in the air. Oil is the blood of modern warfare. It powers ships and aircraft and tanks. It enables transportation and manufacturing. Without oil, a modern military cannot function. He gestured at the chart. Japan was fighting a war with a teaspoon of blood against an opponent with an ocean. The room was completely silent. He continued through more statistics. Aluminum, rubber, coal, copper, food production, industrial capacity. Every category told the same story. Every number pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The war had been unwinnable from the start. By mid-1942, the lieutenant colonel said, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether Japan would lose, but when and at what cost. He paused. The cost, as we now know, was catastrophic for both sides. He did not mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki by name. He did not need to. Michiko stood up. The movement was sudden, unexpected. Her chair scraped against the floor. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Her body was trembling. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. When she spoke, her voice shook with barely contained emotion. You knew. The lieutenant colonel looked at her calmly. Your leaders knew, Michiko continued. They had these numbers. They had to know what they were facing. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. After 1942, after Midway, after the tide had turned, they knew. They knew it was hopeless. Her voice rose. But they kept fighting. They kept sending young men to deep. They kept telling mothers that their sons' deaths meant something. She was almost screaming now. 3 more years. 3 more years of death and suffering and destruction. And for what? For pride, for honor, for the refusal to admit what they already knew. She pointed at the charts. Every death after 1942 was a murder. Our own government murdered its own people because surrender was shameful. The room remained frozen. The lieutenant colonel did not argue. He did not defend. He simply nodded slowly. War is terrible, he said quietly, and those who prolong it when victory is impossible bear a special burden of responsibility. He looked at the assembled women. I am sorry for what you have endured, all of you. I am sorry that your leaders chose pride over lives. I am sorry that this war continued long after it should have ended. He paused. I wish I could say that America was blameless. We are not. We made choices that also cost lives. We dropped bombs that killed civilians. We are not innocent. His voice was heavy. But I hope that what you have seen here, what you have experienced in this camp has shown you that Americans are not the demons you were told we were, just as you are not the demons some Americans believe you to be. He began to gather his materials. We are all just people, caught up in something larger than ourselves, trying to serve him, trying to understand, trying to find a way forward. The breaking that night, the barracks dissolved into grief. 300 women wept without restraint. The sounds of sobbing echoed through the wooden buildings and drifted out into the cold Wisconsin night. This was not the quiet crying of private sorrow. This was collective anguish, shared and amplified, bouncing between bodies until it became something larger than any individual could contain. Reiko lay on her bed and thought about every soldier who had died in her arms, every young man who had whispered his final prayer, believing that his death mattered, every mother's son who had trusted the empire to tell him the truth. She had been part of the lie, not intentionally, not knowingly, but she had repeated the propaganda. She had comforted dying boys with false promises. She had told them America was weak when America was throwing food away. The guilt was crushing. Ayumi curled into a ball on her mattress and thought about her father, about his empty bowl, about his smile as he watched her eat his last meal. He had died believing. He had starved himself for a cause that was already lost. His sacrifice had purchased nothing except his daughter's survival, and even that survival now felt like a burden rather than a gift. How do you honor a death that should not have happened? How do you carry a sacrifice that should never have been necessary? Michiko sat at the edge of her bed, writing in a notebook by the dim light from the window. She was recording everything, every number, every date, every detail she could remember about the broadcast she had made and the lies she had told. Someone had to remember. Someone had to ensure that this truth was preserved. If they forgot, if they let the propaganda fade into comfortable amnesia, it could happen again. It would happen again. Tomoko moved through the barracks, not comforting, but simply being present. She stopped at each bed, touched each shoulder, acknowledged each grief. She had been a teacher. She had shaped young minds, and those minds had been sent to war carrying beliefs she had planted. The weight of that responsibility would never fully lift, but perhaps it could be transformed into something else. Perhaps the teacher who had spread lies could become the teacher who spread truth. The crying continued through the night. Guards looked in occasionally, their faces confused and concerned, but they did not interfere. This was necessary. This breaking was the path to rebuilding. The grief had to be released before healing could begin. In late December, the first letters arrived from Japan. They came in bundles sorted by name, already opened and censored by military intelligence. Black marks obscured certain passages, but enough remained to convey the essential messages. Reiko received a letter from her mother. The handwriting was shaky, unsteady, so different from the precise characters her mother had always formed. The letter was brief. Your father is gone. He passed in October. His heart gave out. The doctor said it was weakness from long hunger. Kenji is with me. We are surviving. Food is coming now. The Americans bring supplies. Do not worry about us. Take care of yourself. Come home when you can. Reiko read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. Her father was dead, starved to death because he gave his food to his children. Gone while she was crossing America, on a train eating 3 meals a day, sleeping on soft mattresses. The irony was so cruel that it almost seemed designed. Ayumi received no letter. Her father was already gone. Her mother had died years before. There was no one left to write. She watched other women read their letters with expressions of joy or grief or confusion. She sat alone on her bed and tried to feel something other than the hollow emptiness that had become her constant companion. Michiko's letter came from her sister in Osaka. The city is damaged but standing. Many buildings are gone, but many remain. People are working to rebuild. The Americans are not what we expected. They bring food and medicine. They are helping. Mother asks about you constantly. She prays for your return. We all do. The war is over, but we are still here. That seems like a miracle now. Michiko read those words and felt something shift inside her chest. The war was over. Japan still existed. Her family was alive. For the first time since the ship, since San Francisco, since the train and the farmland and the children and the apple, she allowed herself to think about the future. Not the past she had lost, not the lies she had told, the future she might still build. On Christmas Day, the camp held a small celebration. The Americans had decorated a tree in the main hall. Presents had been gathered for the prisoners. Small things. Soap and writing paper and books and small tokens that cost little but meant much. The women received the gifts with something approaching wonder. These people, their captors, their enemies had thought about them during their holiday, had wrapped presents, had tried to create joy. After the gifts were distributed, Grace the interpreter stood to speak. Some of you have asked why you have been treated this way, she said. Why food and medicine and kindness instead of punishment and deprivation? She paused. I cannot speak for all Americans. I can only speak for what I have observed. She looked around the room at the faces watching her. Americans do not all agree on everything. They argue about politics and religion and how to raise children and 1,000 other things. But most of them share certain beliefs. She held up one finger. They believe that cruelty for its own sake is wrong. A second finger. They believe that everyone deserves basic dignity, even enemies. A third. They believe that how you treat the helpless says more about you than how you treat the powerful. She lowered her hand. This is not universal. There are cruel Americans just as there are cruel people everywhere. But the cruelty is not celebrated. It is not official policy. It is not considered honorable. She smiled slightly. You were told that Americans were monsters. You have now lived among them for months. You have seen how they treat prisoners. You have seen how they treat each other. She gestured around the decorated hall. What do you believe now? No one answered. But the answer was written on every face. The monsters had turned out to be ordinary people, flawed and complicated and sometimes kind. Not so different from the Japanese themselves when stripped of the propaganda and the hatred and the uniforms, just people, caught up in something larger than themselves, trying to survive, trying to understand, trying to find a way forward. The women were repatriated in stages throughout 1946. By the time Reiko boarded the ship that would carry her back to Japan, she had spent nearly a year in American custody. She had gained 20 pounds. Her hair was thick and shiny. Her skin was clear. She looked like a different person than the hollow ghost who had stepped off the transport at Guam. But the changes inside were even more profound. She carried notebooks filled with medical knowledge she had gained from the American staff, techniques and procedures and understanding that could help rebuild healthcare in her shattered country. She carried memories of kindness that she had not expected and could not forget. The guard who had given her his chocolate bar. The nurse who had spent hours explaining antibiotics. The doctor who had treated her with respect and dignity. She carried grief that would never fully heal. For her father, for Kenji the soldier, for all the young men who had died believing lies she had repeated. And she carried a determination that had crystallized during those months at Camp McCoy. She would tell the truth, not for revenge, not for blame, but because truth was the only foundation on which anything lasting could be built. The lies had cost too much. The propaganda had killed too many. The comfortable fictions that leaders told their people to justify war had destroyed an entire generation. Never again, not if she could help it. Michiko left the camp with her notebooks full of numbers and dates and details. She would spend years writing about her experiences, about the broadcasts, about the laws, about the devastating truth she had discovered crossing America on a train. Her accounts would become part of the historical record, a witness testimony to the cost of propaganda and the price of pride. Ayumi returned to Japan and eventually completed her university education. She became a teacher like Tomoko had been, but she taught differently. She taught her students to question, to verify, to never accept official truth without evidence. She taught them that governments lie, that propaganda kills, that the most dangerous words in any language are, "The enemy is weak." Tomoko went back to teaching as well, but now she taught about critical thinking and media literacy. She taught her students how to recognize propaganda when they encountered it. She taught them that loving your country did not mean believing everything your country told you. The women scattered across Japan and rebuilt their lives as best they could. They married or did not marry. They had children or did not have children. They found work and meaning and reasons to continue. But they never forgot those months in America, the food, the kindness, the devastating truth that had shattered their world and set them free. They had been prisoners of war, but the real prison had been the lies, and they had escaped. Decades later, an elderly woman stood before a classroom of university students in Tokyo. Her name was Reiko Nakamura. She was 83 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear and strong. She had been invited to speak about her experiences during the war, about the field hospitals, about the prisoners, about the journey across America that had changed everything she believed. She told them about the food on the ship, about the children at the train station, about the apple thrown away after 3 bites. She told them about the numbers, the production figures, the mathematical impossibility of victory that their leaders had known and hidden. She told them about the kindness of enemies, about hot showers and wool blankets and Christmas presents in a prisoner of war camp. And she told them about the lies. "We were told Americans were weak," she said. "We were told they were starving. We were told victory was certain." She paused. None of it was true. And because we believed lies, millions died who did not have to die. She looked out at the young faces watching her. "You live in a different time. You have access to information that we could never have imagined. You can verify claims. You can question authority. You can seek truth." Her voice grew stronger. "Use that power. Question everything. Verify before you believe. And never, never trust those who tell you that the enemy is weak and victory is certain." She smiled, but her eyes held something ancient and sad. "The enemy is never as weak as they say. Victory is never as certain as they promise. And the truth, however painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie." She bowed to the students and left the stage. Outside, the sun was setting over Tokyo, a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt, a nation that had been defeated and transformed, a people who had learned slowly and painfully that the stories they told themselves mattered more than they had ever imagined. Reiko stood watching the sunset and remembered a young soldier named Kenji, 16 years old, dying in her arms, asking if the Americans were starving. She had told him yes, she had been wrong, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to make that wrong mean something, to ensure that the truth, however painful, would be the foundation of whatever came next. The sun slipped below the horizon. Reiko turned and walked slowly home. The war was 70 years in the past, but its lessons would never be finished teaching.